Today we're going to be ranking the units the Space Marines have access to and talking about which are the strongest. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. So in this review of Space Marine units, I've ranked them in 4 tiers, starting from tier 4 the lowest to tier 1 the highest. For the comparison, I'm going to be focusing on Space Marine units that actually give and receive damage, as opposed to buffing units and characters, and other units that act with synergy with other units, such as transports, at least for the most part. Also, for the sake of this video not going on all year, I've not added in the vast majority of the Forge World datasheets, which I'm well aware the Marines have absolutely tons of. I have mentioned a few that I think are the very strongest in the top couple of tiers, but by and large they're not going to be part of the tier ranking. Please bear in mind that these are absolutely all my own opinion, although I will try and give some insights as to why I've ranked them where I did as we go along in the video. If you think I've ranked anything too low or too high, then please let me know. It'd be good to get some discussion going down in the comments. In any case, let's jump right into it. So in my opinion, some of the weakest units in the Space Marine Codex are these 4. The Assault Squads, Attack Bikes, Land Speeders, and the Land Raider variants. Frankly, Assault Squads have struggled in the game since even before 8th edition began. Games Workshop always feels the need that they need a higher points cost because they can move faster, and while mobility is very helpful, when they actually get to the foe they don't always tend to do all that much, just armed with chainswords. Combined with not being troops really doesn't help them out at all. They're pretty much entirely eclipsed by Vanguard veterans, who do what they do much better. Attack Bikes are next. Despite recent points drops, still durability point for point, they're pretty bad, and their firepower isn't exactly outstanding, with either a multi-melter or a heavy bolter plus a twin bolt gun. I'd say their best use is to fill slots in brigades, just because they're so cheap, and if you can't afford a stronger unit. Next we have Land Speeders. Very similar problems to the Attack Bikes, very weak to defense, reasonable offense, but there are plenty of units that do both very well. I like these guys best with Typhoon missile launchers, but they just don't stack up very well compared with the Space Marine Flyers or other various Space Marine heavy guns which can also move pretty fast these days, particularly as Rhino chassis vehicles still move 12 inches. Finally, I've put the Land Raider variants on here, and I could certainly see it being argued that they should have been on the next tier up. I just feel that despite their pretty redoubtable stat line, they do have fairly decent survivability. Their damage output is just very underwhelming, and they're only really worth it if you're transporting other units into battle, which is a bit of a questionable tactic in the first place with the way that transport rules in 8th edition work. There is a good reason that we never really see them in competitive lists. I'm certainly not saying that you can't make any of these units work. Certainly all Space Marines got a big lease of life between all the options they got in the supplement books and their combat doctrines and shock assault, but you just might be having to work a little bit harder and making more mental effort than with other simpler to use options. Moving on to the 3rd tier then, which is also the biggest tier on this list. Firstly, we have some Space Marine Rhino chassis fire support, the Vindicator, Stalker and Predator. All of them are reasonably tough and have reasonable fire support, but I just think tend to be outcompeted by other options a little bit, in particular the Predator that doesn't stack up very well against most other options in the Space Marine list. The Stalker at least has an interesting stratagem in Skyfire which helps it out a lot, and the Vindicator certainly can go off with a massive bang if you roll hot for it, but again you don't tend to see these guys used as much in competitive play. Next up we have a clutch of Dreadnoughts, the standard Contemptor from the Codex, the Venerable Dreadnought, Ironclad Dreadnought, and the Standard Dreadnought. Now in particular, all the ones that mix melee and range tend to struggle just a little bit, as they want to do 2 fundamentally different things, and they're penalised for their firepower if they move towards to get to close combat. They're also somewhat slow, so they're not very likely to get to close combat before your opponents had a chance to shoot them quite a bit. I've got a little bit more time for the Dreadnought and Vendread with missile launcher and lad cannons. In certain builds, maybe these could have been in the next tier above. Next up we have a couple of Flyers in the Storm Raven and Storm Talon gunships. Fairly decent fire support, but reasonably fragile despite their -1 to hit penalty, at least point for point. Now you can't keep them in Devastator Doctrine all game with Iron Hands or Imperial Fists. I don't think that we'll see these guys played quite as much, though Flyers are always interesting options, particularly ones with decent firepower, as they can move very fast and get some interesting line of sights, or snipe some characters potentially. Next up we have a trio of veterans in the Vanguard veterans, Stern Guard veterans and Company veterans. The Company veterans are an interesting little choice that can fill out elite slots and get some cheap storm shields and storm bolters and aren't bad for holding the line, but in general we tend to use troops to fill this role, meaning that we don't see them played like this all that much. The Stern Guard do have some interesting gimmick builds, particularly things like combi flamers in a drop pod with a successor chapter to get them all in range with flamers and then use some salamanders strats on them, or potentially just go very heavy on their special issue bolters and use their unique stratagem for +1 to wound. Unfortunately, I really do think that they need some sort of gimmick to compete because their firepower just isn't all amazingly strong for their points cost, particularly in a Space Marine list where there's so many bolt shots flying around, and with only 1 wound apiece they're just not really quite as durable as their Primaris counterparts. Vanguard veterans I know are definitely more competitive in certain armies rather than others. If we're talking about White Scars or Blood Angels, then they could potentially be in tier 2 or tier 1. And I fully admit perhaps I should have ranked them higher as a result. Having a whole bunch of Space Marines deep strike behind Storm Shield protection and hit you very hard with Thunderhammers is pretty decent, particularly as they can get themselves to close combat pretty easily, even with Storm Shields they do tend to be a little bit glass hammery once they're there. Unless you are playing a very assault orientated chapter strategy though, then I would generally say that Vanguard veterans will belong here. Again, compared with some of the other options, they hit quite hard but are relatively fragile to anti-infantry firepower, at least point for point. Next I've put the Redemptor Dreadnought in this class as well, although I would caveat that with saying that it is on the whole stronger than the other classes of Dreadnought available from the core codex. It does suffer from all of their issues, but it's just generally a bit stronger in terms of raw strength, having a decent amount of wounds and getting a ton of general purpose strength 5 firepower, meaning that it will usually make its presence felt, at least somewhat, even before it makes close combat. I've also chosen to put the standard repulsor in this section, just to clarify that this is the standard variant, not the executioner. It's moderately tough point for point, and has fairly reasonable firepower, but in particular when the repulsor executioner exists, it really does make this one look a fair bit worse, and at the moment I would generally take a repulsor executioner rather than the standard. Next up are Reavers, the Primaris Space Marine unit that doesn't know quite what it's supposed to be doing. Fairly tough, some interesting mobility options, but really not all that much in terms of damage output. If they were troops, I think people might take them more. They can do some reasonable work to infantry and melee, but in a fairly crowded Space Marine elite slot, people tend to want to take things that can damage all targets, not just light infantry. Moving on, we have Hellblasters, who everyone wants to make work with their very big cool snazzy plasma weapons, and if they get to unload their shots on a key target, they can certainly make it go away. The problem is just their points cost in my opinion. They're just a little bit too expensive for their damage output and how fragile they are. Again, their main issue is mainly just being outcompeted by the other Space Marine options. Inceptors are next on the list. General purpose deep strike Primaris with assault bolters or plasma weapons. They certainly gained a lot out of the new codex with their additional wound, and like Hellblasters I think they're a unit that very nearly gets there, but just are a tiny bit more expensive than they should be for the job that they do. Next I've included Terminators and their variants here. In general at the moment I feel the Bolter and Power Fist arms of Terminators and their Cataphractii and Tartarus variants are slightly more competitive than the Terminator Assault Squad, due to the weight of bolter fire being pretty considerable with bolter discipline. I think the Terminators do have some competitive potential, with deep strike, reasonable shooting and decent melee damage, but because of their points cost I do think that they need to be played pretty carefully. You can't just use them as a blunt instrument to go in and smash everything. They need to do clever things like keeping themselves safe by wrapping and trapping units in close combat. Not bad, but maybe lacking some of the raw strength of some of the other options. Devastator squads in general seem to have fallen out of fashion a little bit in terms of backline fire support, as their point for point damage output isn't significantly better than other options, but they do tend to be a bit more fragile than most, only being defended by the standard Tactical Marine stat line. They do have one very competitive build in the Grav Devastator drop pod, which I certainly think would be ranked a lot higher, perhaps even tier 1, but for general purposes the Devastator squad just isn't all that strong in its traditional role. Tactical Marines are somewhat similar. The 1 point reduction that they got to 12 points a model certainly helped them out, and they can be good ways to fill out Space Marine battalions, particularly if you're wanting to pack some isolated backfield heavy weapons. Most people seem to be using Intercessors for their raw muscle, toughness and extra attacks in close combat these days however, relegating Tactical Marines to being somewhat niche backfield objective grabbers, which again they're sometimes outcompeted by Intercessors with Stalker Bolters. Finally, towards the top of this tier we have Bike Squads and Scout Bikes. Now these guys are a unit that I was very tempted to put in tier 2, mainly because they have that very efficient build that has 3 bikes and the sergeant with a storm bolter that puts out an absolute ton of shots, and they are very mobile and able to harass and annoy the enemy army. They're still quite fragile when fielded this way, but they do put out a decent amount of highly mobile firepower. Aside from this though, bikes do tend to be a little bit underwhelming in a raw damage and durability contest. They can get to the opponent very fast, but they aren't particularly good in close combat, so they can sometimes be useful additions to a marine army, but not something I typically ever take more than a few of. Now we're moving on to Tier 2, and we're starting to get on to some of the decently competitive units in the Marine Codex. First up we have Suppressor Squads with their autocannons, somewhat similar to the Hellblasters in their role, but I think they're just pointed a little bit more appropriately, and of course they do have their jump back movement options. They do put out some pretty decent general purpose damage with those autocannons, but their relatively low durability does hold them back somewhat. Next I've included the Hunter anti-air vehicle here, who I admit does have a really big gun on the top of it, but at its current points cost, it's really quite a nice little durability unit that you can add to your Space Marine list. For a ludicrously cheap 75 points, you can get a Toughness 8 11 wound vehicle, being point for point one of the most durable vehicles in the game. They're so cheap that you can afford to run them round as screening and annoyance vehicles, all while popping off very powerful missile launcher shots that re-roll their hit rolls at base. Not a bad unit for increasing the tankiness of your Space Marine army. Next we have Devastator Centurions, who with their Hurricane Bolters and Heavy Bolters, Grav Cannons or Las Cannons are very decent firepower on a point for point basis. Hurricane Bolters are always great, and the Dev Cents get more guns even on top of that. They're arguably the single biggest and scariest infantry unit that you can get in Codex Space Marines, and are one of the best units for stacking buffs and combos onto, particularly things like deep striking them with Raven Guard, where if we're considering that, I'd argue they are absolutely top tier. Unless you are using some sort of special tricks, for the majority of armies they are a little bit let down by their relatively low durability compared with tanks and things, but if you can find a way to protect them or further soup up their damage output, then they're a really strong unit indeed. Next we have Impulsors, who I know are a dedicated transport vehicle, which I haven't generally included on this list, but I wanted to mention them just because they add some very decent mobility options, and in particular some extra durability with Impulsors with shield domes. We've not exactly seen entire lists of them being run yet, and I think that this is at least partly due to the price tag on the kit itself, but being able to zoom a unit up to the front lines in no time at all, and then be an annoying disruption and distraction threat after that, can easily be worth the Impulsor's cheap points cost, all while blazing away with anti-infantry weapons. Next I've included the Stormhawk Interceptor here, which I still believe slightly outperforms the Storm Raven and Storm Talon at the moment. Getting toughness 7 and -1 to hit from enemy flyers is a really good survivability boost, and this thing just has some absolutely murderous guns on it in the twin assault cannons, plus whatever other armament you choose. It certainly took a bit of a hit not being in Devastator Doctrine all game, but at the moment I think it's probably the strongest Space Marine flyer on a points for points basis. Next we have Infiltrators and Incursors, who are basically very similar to Intercessors, except you pay a bit of a premium for them to set up in scout deployments near the enemy, and you pay even more of a premium on the Infiltrators for them to be able to use their jammers and stop enemy units from deep striking anywhere within 12 inches of them. I think that these guys can be a unit that add a ton of utility when taken in small numbers, but I wouldn't generally run an entire army of them due to the slight premium that you pay over the Intercessors for their scout deployments. In a similar vein, Space Marine Scouts also provide those forward deployment, screening and getting into your opponent's face advantages, while also being the cheapest troops choice in the Codex, which is certainly a plus. They're not quite as tanky as the Infiltrators and Incursors, but there's certainly value in being able to put down multiple small units of them all over the board, and having some more expendable cheap troops, and they're certainly one of the strongest Space Marine troops choices at the moment. Next we have the standard Whirlwinds, who went from relative obsolescence to being one of the stronger ignores line of sight fire support units in the whole game. Very cheap at just 80 or 85 points, these guys are reasonably durable and have decent damage output, and are good to help focus down a key threat, particularly if not all of your army can see it. Finally, we have the Repulsor Executioner, with its devastating laser weapon and enormous plasma gun. This guy is one of the premier long-range Space Marine anti-tank choices, is decently tough, reasonably mobile when it needs to be, and also comes with a smattering of anti-infantry firearms. It's not quite as overly strong as it was when you could castle it up with Ironfather Fyros and the Ironstone to make a bunch of Repulsor Executioners almost impossible to kill, but it still has a very meaty stat line indeed, and enemy armour aren't going to welcome it as a sight on the other side of the battlefield. So now we get onto the very top tier, the units that at the moment I think are the strongest for the Space Marines. Firstly, we have the Aggressor Squad. These guys were one of the real winners of the new Codex, getting an additional attack and an additional wound, meaning now they're reasonably tanky, have awesome anti-infantry firepower, and are very scary in close combat too. They also don't even move that slowly due to being able to advance and fire, so they can really get up the board quite quickly and become a problem for your opponent really fast, even if they're foot slogging across the board. Several chapters, including the Ultramarines, have the option for a unit of moving and double shooting aggressors. You can deploy them in reserve with Raven Guard, or use Master Ambush to get them right up close and personal from turn 1, and they can also benefit from the Ironfather Fyros and Chief Apothecary's 5+ Invul and 5+ Feel No Pain type save that we're seeing in the strong Iron Hands infantry castle lists at the moment. Talking of those, I've also chosen to include Intercessors here. In terms of raw damage output and strength, I don't think that Intercessors are quite as strong as Aggressors, but they are a troops choice, meaning that you are going to want some for your army, and they're very solid for securing objectives, being very durable, and putting out a decent amount of anti-infantry fire that you can tailor somewhat by choosing what bolt gun they have. They're generally a reasonable troops choice to go for, no matter what codex you're using, and as we already mentioned, can get incredibly hard to kill indeed when they're combined with the Chief Apothecary and Ironfather Phyros in that castle build. Next we have the Leviathan Dreadnought with the dual storm cannons. This one is Forge World, but as he's so strong I thought we'd talk about him. He's short ranged at 24 inches, but he has 20 shots of horrendous strength 7 firepower that will put a dent in pretty much any target in the game. He's very multi-purpose, and the firepower is pretty cheap for how many points you pay. He's also very tanky behind a 2-up save, toughness 8, 4+ invul, and 14 wounds. And because he's a really big dreadnought, he's pretty much an ideal target to use Duty Eternal on, or for the Iron Hands to target with their Ironstone, although as of the latest FAQ, not both, thankfully. With his short range and ability to get locked up in close combat, he certainly has counterplay to him, but he's most certainly a scary threat that your opponent will have to consider and react to in the game. Next we've got another Forge World entry, and these are the Contemptor Mortis Dreadnoughts, or the Relic Contemptor Dreadnoughts, equipped with 2 sets of twin las cannons. As they hit on 2s with 4 shots for their points cost, at 48-inch range these are pretty much the premier Space Marine anti-tank unit. They're also very durable on top of that, safe behind a 5+ invul, 10 wounds at toughness 7, and even more protection if you upgrade to the Relic version. And a simple, very strong firepower at a good ballistic skill. Next up we have the Assault Centurions, who are just ludicrously dangerous for their points cost. They're generally equipped with Hurricane Bolters and Siege Drills for just 52 points, meaning that you can pretty much entirely justify them if they were just a ranged unit, as a big squad for a bit over 300 points will be putting out 72 Ignores Cover Bolter shots downrange, which is easily going to mess up any light infantry that your opponent has coming in. Their value only gets even better though if they do get in range to use their Flamers and Siege Drills, only adding to their anti-infantry firepower, and with 25 attacks at the profile of a boosted Thunderhammer, they'll have a damn good go at killing virtually anything in the game. Their weakness is of course their mobility, although if you are using them in a chapter without any special tricks, walking them straight up the centre of the board isn't the worst idea. You'll force your opponent to back well off and give up any centre objectives, or let them unleash their Siege Drills and Flamers. Things get very silly though if you can unleash them as Raven Guard or White Scars and get them a deep strike option to get them right up and close to the enemy, meaning that you get to turn up, dump 72 bolter shots into the opponent, and then hopefully get a charge straight from deep strike as well. Moving on, we have the Thunderfire Cannon, which has been a staple in Space Marine lists since the codex dropped. With a 2+ ballistic skill and decent anti-infantry fire, it's great for clearing out objectives and just adding on a few more wounds to whatever unit on the board most needs it. Being reasonably hard to remove with that 2+ armor save, and you can always deploy it out of line of sight. The Tech Marine can repair the cannon itself or any other nearby vehicles you happen to have. And of course it has a couple of great stratagems, either being able to fire twice or to use some tremor shells to mess with the opponent's movement. It certainly lost out a little bit in the doctrines changed, but it's still easily strong enough to see plenty of play. Next up we have the Eliminators. I'd like to specify that these ones are Eliminators with bolt sniper rifles. I think that the last fusils are reasonable as well, but they'd probably be more tier 2 or tier 3 in my mind. I've already done numerous Math Hammer comparisons featuring these guys, and they seem to win pretty much every time. Those Mortis rounds plus the Sergeant's guided aim ability for +1 to hit and wound are just absolutely vicious going through any hard targets, and 3 squads of these guys can pretty much guarantee the death of the vast majority of characters in all of 40k. On top of this, they have some additional ammo types for firing out of line of sight or putting a bit more fire into infantry should you need it, are very obnoxious to remove in cover due to those camo cloaks giving them effectively a 1-up save, and can also do scout deployment to get better lines of sight, or you can even use them as screening in missions that need it more. They're certainly undercosted for the amount of utility that you get, making them easily one of Space Marine's strongest units right now. Moving on, we have another Forge World piece, and this one is the Chaplain Dreadnought. I was honestly quite surprised he escaped unscathed from the Space Marine nerf that came out recently, and my hopes certainly aren't high for him whenever the Spring Balance update drops. Chaplain Dreadnoughts can't be targeted because of the character keyword. They now provide litanies in addition to their normal buff, have very good melee stats point for point, reasonable survivability on top of the character protection, and can also pack a twin las cannon that hits on 2s that your opponent won't be able to do anything about as he can't target it with his own anti-tank weapons. It's a very potent combination for the points and can make Chaplain Dreadnoughts a bit of a nightmare to deal with on the table. Finally, we come on to the Invicta Tactical Warsuits. Again, this one does very well in my math hammer comparisons, both from a shooting and a melee perspective. That twin autocannon really packs a punch, and you can always switch out for the flamer if it better suits your strategy. And having a couple of decent AP heavy stubbers and a heavy bolter and another small anti-infantry weapon means that this thing really does pump out a lot of shots and will keep on causing damage to the enemy army in the shooting phase. The thing that makes it truly strong though is its ability to be able to deploy right up close and personal to the enemy, meaning that you can get first turn charges with a Dreadnought Power Fist and do serious damage to the enemy army and potentially lock up other units as well. Deploying a trio of Invictas on the borderline of the enemy deployment is something that a lot of armies are going to have trouble with, as with their decent movement, they're likely going to be able to get deep into your deployment zone turn 1 if you don't screen them out. Again, I think they're certainly undercosted for what they deliver in terms of their base stat abilities. So let me know your thoughts and opinions on the tier list down in the comments below, particularly if you think I've overestimated the value of any of these or underestimated the value of some of the ones lower down. I did try and explain my reasoning as we went along, but it'd be interesting to hear any counter opinions, as I know that dividing things into arbitrary tiers will always lead to differing opinions, as everyone's got their own particular insights and experience as to what they feel is strongest in the game. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we have plenty of 40k content coming out every single day, including plenty more for the Space Marines. If you'd like to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon page, the link's in the description below. As well as helping the creation of new videos, there's some other benefits, including getting some videos early, voting on what comes next, and the occasional prize draw where I give away some new box sets. If any of that interests you, please take a look, the link is in the description. In any case, a big thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.